Hello all and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be reviewing the European colonization of North America. I conceived of this video as a companion to the first two episodes of my naval history series and a bit of preparation for the ones to come. I personally have been a fan of the game Civilization since I first played it, and I played a version of it called Colonization several times. Playing that version of the game, I always thought it allowed the player to build up the colonies much faster than may have actually happened in real life. By the time I might reach the need to declare independence in the game, I often find that I have a well-developed and capable economy able to build the units needed for defense. Not surprisingly, I favor naval units at this stage of the game. Before attempting this project, I always thought that it was only the game, and therefore isn't really that close to reality. Yet my research into the colonial period made me realize that the game really isn't as far off as I originally thought it was in that regard. When you actually finish the game, you have the option to do a replay, where you get to see where every colony, every settlement was actually founded, and you get to see a timeline and wars and that type of stuff. So as a kind of nod to that, this video is going to follow that same format, except we're actually going to use real data from mainly Wikipedia to get a sense of what really happened on the eastern seaboard of the United States, starting at the beginning. And that beginning, as far as I can tell, started about 1000 AD with the attempt to settle the Oxen Meadows by the Scandinavians. That colony did not last, although Scandinavians are believed to have been active in the area for several years prior and after the settlement attempt. Now, there has been speculation and even evidence that the Scandinavians were active in North America as late as the 1300s. Yet there is still much controversy as to the extent and range of these activities. Even so, sporadic contact may have continued even after that time, as fishermen were known to have crossed the Atlantic and may have even established seasonal camps in Newfoundland and even other areas of what is now Canada. Regardless, though, of what contact may have happened in the intervening years, permanent contact between Europe and the Americas was only effectively established with Columbus starting in 1492. At that time, only Spain and Portugal were involved in the contact and were focused on the Caribbean and South America, where they were able to extract gold and grow cash crops such as sugar on large plantations. Explorations of North America revealed a more hostile environment with no indications of gold or other precious metals in any sort of abundance, so the area was pretty much left unsettled. The first recorded attempt at settlement that I could find of North America happened in 1559 when some 1,500 Spanish settlers from Veracruz, Mexico, attempted to establish an outpost on Pensacola Bay. However, that same year a hurricane effectively destroyed the settlement, and in 1560 the survivors left the area only to return and in 1561 finally abandon the attempt. The French, meanwhile, had been exploring North America for several years, and in 1562 decided to try and establish their first colony. The people who did this were actually French Protestants, who kind of went against the state religion of France. And they tried to establish Charles Fort at what is now Paris Island in modern-day South Carolina. However, like Pensacola, this colony really didn't last very long. The leader of the colony returned to Europe to arrange resupply, but was arrested by the English before he could do so. Faced with starvation, all but one of the remaining men left the colony in a boat that they built and attempted to cross the Atlantic without any sort of navigation equipment. The survivors were eventually picked up by an English ship. The remaining man who stayed at the fort was eventually discovered and captured by the Spanish. The Protestant French tried again in what is now Florida, in a settlement they called Fort Caroline in 1564. However, this territory was claimed by the Spanish. In 1565, both a French and Spanish fleet arrived at the fort about the same time. The French fleet was successful at beating back the Spanish, who retreated about 35 miles and established St. Augustine as a future base of operations. The Spanish then marched overland in a storm in order to attack the French on the morning of the 20th of September, 1565. They destroyed the fort and settlement and took about 50 women and children prisoner while killing an estimated 200 French. In the meantime, the French fleet had encountered a storm and had been run aground and sunk south of St. Augustine. Marching northward, the surviving French were met and captured by the Spanish, and despite having surrendered and therefore expecting good treatment, the French were massacred as heretics. The Spanish then built a new fort called San Mateo at the site of Fort Caroline. Another French force attacked and burned this fort in April 1568. They also massacred their prisoners, this time in retribution for the massacre of their countrymen in 1565. Yet prior to those events of 1568, the Spanish attempted in 1566 to settle on Paris Island themselves in a settlement they called Santa Elena. This new settlement would actually be used as the territorial capital until 1587. When I first saw the movie Patriot starring Mel Gibson, and loosely based on the actions of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, I was surprised by the scenes in which the colonists used an old Spanish mission as their base of operations. However, during the period that Santa Elena existed, it was used by the Spanish as a base of operations for the establishment of missions and other settlements in a wide area of what is now the southern states of the United States of America. As covered in the video episode 1 of the Naval History series, the English attempted to establish a colony on Roanoke Island, first in 1585 and then again in 1587. The original purpose of this colony was to support English privateering operations against the Spanish treasure fleets that transited through Florida. Also in 1587, due to conflict with the natives and a lack of interest by the Spanish in the area, the settlements and missions supported by Santa Elena were abandoned, with the colonial survivors retreating to St. Augustine. Due to Spanish operations to suppress the English activities against them, which culminated in the Spanish Armada actions of 1588, the Roanoke colony went unsupported and was eventually abandoned. The lack of contact with settlers after 1587 has led it to be considered a lost colony, although the colonists probably integrated into the local native population as a way to survive the relatively harsh conditions of the period. In any case, the Roanoke colony is believed to have been abandoned by 1590. The next attempt by non-Spanish Europeans to settle in North America came in 1600 when the French established a small trading post called Tadoussac, where the Saguenay River empties into the St. Lawrence. Now, normally I wouldn't include any supposed settlement called in the records a trading post, because a lot of times these were seasonal and very short-lived settlements. For instance, late in the 1600s, the French established a small trading post in Wisconsin near present-day Green Bay. It was used for only a short while, and then it was abandoned for several decades before anybody returned to it. Tadoussac never became a major city, and doesn't really show up in the historical records beyond this point. Yet it had continued to be inhabited even up to the present day, and was involved not only in trading with the native peoples, but in the fisheries and general shipping of the area, and what would become Canada. In fact, for 30 years it's listed as the only seaport that the French had. Therefore, it seems important enough to mention and be recorded, so it's going to show up on our records. At this point, it's important to mention that the French would figure pretty big into the history of Canada. Jacques Cartier would explore the area starting in 1534, and had been followed by several other explorers in the area. Altogether, they explored the area of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, at least as far as present-day Green Bay, Wisconsin. Cartier even named the area Canada and claimed it for the French crown. According to legend, upon arriving in the area, a member of his crew asked what they should call the new land, to which he exclaimed, "Nada!" to mean, "there's nothing here," and the name stuck as it seemed so appropriate. However, more truthfully, Canada was actually an Iroquois word meaning village. Cartier learned this word and called his new discovery the Land of the Canadas. Note the plural there. It was abbreviated to simply Canada to refer to the whole area later. 4 years after Tadoussac, in 1604, the French established another settlement on St. Croix Island under Crown authority. They named the area of the new settlement La Acadia, a derivation of a name given to the entire east coast of North America by early explorers who felt the portions they saw resembled the Acadia district in Greece. After a rough winter, the French moved the settlement across the bay to a better location and established the town of Port Royal in 1605. Acadia would eventually lend its name to a few different groups of people, including one group in modern-day Louisiana known as the Cajuns. 2 years later, in 1607, England's Virginia Company established the settlement of Jamestown on the James River in modern-day Virginia. A few months later, the Virginia Company also attempted to establish the Popham Colony closer to the French in modern-day Maine. This colony was abandoned late in 1608, despite initially having been more successful than Jamestown. It is at this colony that the first ocean-going ship is believed to have been built by the English in North America. The ship was named Virginia and by all accounts was very solidly built and managed to cross the Atlantic a couple of times and survive at least one storm that wrecked several other ships. In 1608, using Port Royal as a base, the French expanded into the interior and established Quebec City, which became the center of the new colony of Canada. In 1610, the English established another colony, this time in Newfoundland, called Cupper's Cove. This colony was established by the Society of Merchant Venturers, and its location was chosen due to its strategic location and its familiarity with fishermen who would often shelter there during the fishing season. The area is first believed to have been discovered by John Cabot, a Venetian who in 1497 was sailing on behalf of England. It had since been very well trafficked by English, French, Portuguese, and other ships involved in the fisheries in the area. This was one of several colonies that would be established in the next few years in the immediate area. It was to this colony that Squantum, better known to us today as Squanto, was taken and learned English. Squanto would also travel from Cuper's Cove to London before finding a passage back to his home in modern-day Massachusetts, where he discovered that his tribe had been wiped out by disease. Later, he would help the Pilgrims in surviving their first winters. In my second episode on naval history, I made a brief reference to an attack by the Virginians on the French in 1613. The target of this attack was Port Royal, Arcadia, and it was utterly destroyed in the attack and would not be rebuilt for several years. Dutch explorers were also active in North America, in particular the Hudson River Valley. In 1614, they built Fort Nassau in present-day Albany, New York, as their first permanent settlement. This fort was replaced in 1617 and would later be replaced by Fort Orange in 1624. Both of the earlier forts were essentially built on islands and suffered damage and eventual destruction from spring runoffs. In 1618, the colony of Harbor Grace near Cuper's Cove was established. As this colony is so close and the town of St. John's would appear nearby in 1620, at this point we will simply change the name of the area to Newfoundland, with the date of the first settlement at Cuper's Cove as the date of the establishment. Also in 1618, that second fort near present-day Albany was abandoned due to being destroyed in spring runoff. 1620 saw the arrival of the Pilgrims and the establishment of Plymouth Colony. Originally they had been headed to settle in Virginia, yet were blown off course and decided to settle where they were. These early settlers occupied a village whose previous inhabitants had died of disease. Soon after, they were introduced to Squanto, who helped them survive in the early years of the colony. Meanwhile, the French established the settlement of Cape Sable, meaning Sandy Cape. In 1623, a group of fishermen established the first colony in New Hampshire. This settlement would be abandoned a few years later in favor of a better site nearby, but continuing the colony. The colony itself would be officially established in 1629. In 1624, the Dutch established Fort Orange near where Fort Nassau had been and Albany now is. Meanwhile, the Massachusetts Bay Company attempted their first settlement at Cape Ann. Additional settlements by both the English and the Dutch were established in 1626. The Massachusetts Bay Company established Salem to replace the failed colony at Cape Ann, yet this colony also struggled to survive. The Dutch established Fort Amsterdam and by extension the settlement of New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan. Smaller settlements and homesteads extended all up and down the Hudson River Valley by this point. By 1629, the 30 Years' War was raging in Europe, and that war spilled over into the colonies. On 1 July 1629, a group of Scots established a settlement at Baleine. Another group, this time privateers, laid siege to Quebec City and had stopped supplies from reaching that colony as early as 1627. The city fell to the privateers on 19 July 1629. Still another group of Scots re-established the colony of Port Royal under a 1621 charter from the king, naming the area Nova Scotia. Baleine in particular was a military post, and was used to harass French shipping in the area. It was attacked and overrun on 10 September 1629. The survivors were used by the French to build a fort and town they called Englishtown nearby. In 1630, a supply fleet called the Winthrop Fleet, after the new governor who sailed in it, came to the relief of the settlement at Salem. At that time, a new settlement between Salem and Plymouth Colony was established on a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of land, originally called the Shawmut Peninsula. The new settlement was named Boston and became the capital of the new Massachusetts Bay Colony. The establishment of Boston marked the beginning of a period of great migration from England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony that would last until the beginning of the English Civil War. This migration saw an additional 20,000 people come from England to the colony, and also saw the establishment of a large number of towns as those who emigrated spread out and brought additional land under cultivation. The colony also began to develop its maritime industries. Actions related to the 30 Years' War ended with a treaty that returned territories captured by the English to the French. In 1632, Quebec was again in French control. Port Royal, Nova Scotia was also ordered to be abandoned, yet it wasn't until late in that year, and only after forces from the settlement raided French settlements near present-day St. John's, New Brunswick. Meanwhile, the French had established a new capital for Acadia at the mouth of the Le Havre River, where they had built a fort. 1633 saw the Massachusetts Bay Colony establish a trading post in what is modern-day Maine at Machias. However, the French were quick to take note and attacked the post and destroyed it, capturing the merchandise and the 4 survivors of the 6 who had been there. Some reports indicate that Port Royal, Nova Scotia had acted as a base for this attack, yet others claim that Port Royal was not resettled by the French until 1635. In 1634, the French established a new settlement further into the St. Lawrence they called Trois-Rivières, or Three Rivers, as it was based where three rivers met. Also in 1634, immigrants of a different sort, this time English Catholics, founded the town of St. Mary's City to serve as the capital of Lord Baltimore's new colony of Maryland. As the Great Migration continued, new colonies were established in New England. In 1635, the colony of Saybrook was established in modern-day Connecticut. The area had also been settled by Dutch prior who gave up their claims in order to negotiate a border based on the Hudson River. 1635 also saw the reoccupation of Port Royal by the French, who made it the capital of Acadia again. The Connecticut colony was initially established in 1636 by a group of Puritan settlers who moved overland from Massachusetts Bay Colony to the Connecticut River. As the area around Boston and Salem was at this point rather well populated, it's time we change the label of the area to Massachusetts Bay Colony and use the establishment of Salem as the colony's year of establishment. Also in 1636, Providence was established by Roger Williams, who had been exiled by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 1637 saw the establishment of New Haven in modern Connecticut by Puritans, and in 1638, other religious outcasts from the Massachusetts Bay Company established the Rhode Island Colony. Due to space limitations, I can't show the New Haven Colony site. Its location was about on the coast where the outside parentheses in the Sable label are. These are just the highlights, as numerous smaller settlements and towns were also being established throughout the area. Meanwhile, in 1638, Swedish-led colonists established New Sweden with the building of Fort Christiana in what is now Delaware. The colony would grow over the years until it was eventually conquered by an army from New Amsterdam in 1655, yet that is still to come. Now we're getting to the point in history where civil unrest in English-controlled territories beginning in about the late 1630s brought about a series of civil wars, the most famous of which was the English Civil War starting in 1642 that deposed the king and brought about parliamentary rule and the rise of Oliver Cromwell. During this period, the English colonies saw little growth, and some colonies even returned to England to fight in the wars. While England was engaged in civil war, the French continued to expand their presence and established another settlement further inland on the St. Lawrence called Montreal in 1642. In 1644, the colony of Saybrook merged with the Connecticut colony. As such, we can now see the New Haven colony that had been established earlier. 1649 saw the establishment of the town of Annapolis, although at the time it was named Province and would be renamed Anne Arundel City before being called Annapolis and becoming the state capital about 1694. Meanwhile, back in England, King Charles I was tried and executed and a commonwealth was established. During the English Civil Wars, the colonies of New England supported the parliamentarians and also the new commonwealth. After all, this new commonwealth's leaders were essentially the same religion as the Pilgrims that first settled in the New England territories. For years, rumors even abounded that Oliver Cromwell and other leaders would even migrate to the Saybrook colony at some future point. Likewise, those in the colony of Virginia tended to support the crown even during the period of the Commonwealth, leading to the nickname Old Dominion for the colony and later the state. Maryland, for its part, became a battleground for forces supporting the different sides, resulting in at least one battle, the Battle of Severn, happening in 1655, well after the English Civil War was over. In 1653, Oliver Cromwell had taken control as Lord Protector in England. He resolved the dispute in Maryland and returned the colony to the control of its Catholic leadership. His leadership also meant that many of those that supported the king during the war left to the Virginia colony. Possibly due to such influxes of new people, settlers from Virginia are believed to have traveled into what is now North Carolina around this time and established the Albemarle Settlements. In 1655, as mentioned before, Dutch forces marched on and captured New Sweden, making it part of New Amsterdam. That same year in England, Oliver Cromwell divided up England into military districts, essentially making him a dictator. 1658 saw the death of Oliver Cromwell from natural causes and his son named Lord Protector in his place. However, his son didn't have the same loyalty from the military and other parties that Oliver Cromwell had commanded. He resigned in 1659. In 1660, Parliament had been restored and decided to invite Charles II to return to England as king. While Charles II did issue pardons to those who had opposed him, this didn't include those who had signed the death warrant for his father, Charles I. 3 of the judges who had signed that death warrant fled to the New Haven colony and were sheltered there. By 1663, the colonies of New France were estimated to have about 2,500 people in total between them. At the same time, the estimated population of the English colonies was around 200,000 people. 1664 became a big year for the English. It was in that year that the English took over the colonies of New Netherland and renamed some of them. New Amsterdam became New York. Fort Orange became Albany. Fort Christina pretty much ceased to exist and a local capital was established in the previous Dutch town of Newcastle. The New Haven colony was also absorbed into the Connecticut colony. Finally, part of the newly acquired territory of New Netherland that had been given to the Duke of York was petitioned off to form New Jersey as payment of debt. The colony was established that same year with Elizabethtown as its capital. Over the next several years, settlers from the Massachusetts Bay Colony in England would establish new settlements throughout the area. In 1670, Charleston in today's South Carolina was established. In 1663, the newly restored King Charles II had granted these lands to 8 loyal friends who became the lord proprietors of the new Carolina colony. The initial site of the settlement was abandoned in 1680 for a more defensible location nearby. At this point, it is difficult to really talk about the individual settlements that were continuing to crop up, so we'll start to look more at major changes. In 1673, a war broke out again between the English and the Dutch, resulting with the Dutch recapturing their former territories in North America. However, in a treaty ending the war in 1674, the colonies were returned to their pre-war status. Meanwhile, tensions between the English settlers in New England and their Native American neighbors brought on a devastating war called King Philip's War after a Native American leader. Approximately 8% of the military-age males in Plymouth Colony alone are believed to have been killed, and fighting in what is now Maine would continue for decades. 1681 saw the formation of the colony of Pennsylvania and the partitioning out of Delaware. Both colonies were under the control of William Penn, who had been granted the land for Pennsylvania by royal charter and leased the land for Delaware in order to allow his Pennsylvania colony to have access to the sea. In 1684, the charters for the colonies that made up New England were dissolved, and a new colony formed from the territory called the Dominion of New England. This was a highly unpopular move in the colonies themselves, and went through several administrations before finally being dissolved in 1689, when the then King of England, James II, was overthrown and replaced by his daughter and her husband, who then ruled jointly as William and Mary. The overthrow of King James had far-reaching effects. Not only did it lead to the dissolution of the Dominion, it also led to war between France and England that spilt over into the colonies. While the population of the English territories exceeded that of the French by some 12 to 1, the French enlisted the help of Native American allies in their attacks on English colonies, while the English and their allies also made attacks on French colonies to include Quebec and most of Acadia. The peace treaty that would come in 1697 would return all territory as it was before the war. As the creation of the Dominion had vacated the existing charter for Massachusetts Bay, and Plymouth never really had one, these colonial governments found that they had very little legal basis for existing. In 1691, rather than restore the status quo as it had existed, the two colonies were formed into one, known as the Province of Massachusetts Bay. 1694 saw the capital of the Maryland colony move from St. Mary's City to the newly renamed Annapolis, and St. Mary's City started to decline and eventually disappeared altogether. In 1698, the Spanish reestablished the settlement of Pensacola that had been abandoned nearly 150 years prior. Pensacola would form one of the 2 population hubs for Spanish Florida, with the other being St. Augustine. In 1699, colonists in the Virginia colony relocated the capital from Jamestown to Middle Plantation, which was renamed Williamsburg. As a result of this, I've changed the map to read Virginia rather than Jamestown, as I believe it is more appropriate. That same year, the French established their first settlement in Louisiana Territory, named Biloxi in what is now Mississippi. In 1701, the French built a settlement and fort along the Detroit River. The next year, 1702, the French established the settlement of Mobile. That same year, another war between England and France broke out, known in North America as Queen Anne's War. This war would last until 1713. During this war, in 1707, England united with Scotland to form Great Britain. Perhaps the most significant event territorially of the war was that the British captured Port Royal in 1710. Meanwhile, either in 1711 or 1712, the administration of the colony of Carolina was formally split into North and South Carolina, establishing those 2 areas as independent colonies. The peace treaty that ended the war in 1713 transferred all of the French colony of Acadia, population about 1,700 people, to the British, along with giving up claims to Newfoundland and Hudson's Bay far to the north. The French retained Cape Breton Island, where Englishtown is, and their territories along the St. Lawrence River. The peace treaty did not, however, fully define the boundaries of Acadia, and disputes continued between the 2 powers. Further, the natives hadn't been represented at all and resisted British attempts at control. These omissions would lead to war again less than 30 years later. In 1718, the French established the town of New Orleans in their Louisiana territory. At that time, it was reported that there were only 700 Europeans living in the whole of the territory. Another 800 were delivered to the territory that year. In 1719, prisoners in Paris were given their freedom if they married prostitutes and moved to that territory. In 1720, the French began construction of Fort Louisbourg, which was to be the biggest and most expensive fortification in the New World up to that time. The next major colonial development didn't occur until 1733, when the colony of Georgia was carved out of South Carolina. This colony was originally envisioned as a place the worthy poor could go to settle and was focused on creating an agrarian society of family farmers. As such, slavery was initially banned in the colony. 1739 would see the initiation of hostilities between the Spanish and the English as the War of Jenkins' Ear. Initially, this conflict would center on the Caribbean, and with some action involved in the new colony of Georgia as well. Both Spain and Britain were not initially involved in the larger war that started in 1740 in Europe, yet by 1742 both sides had been sucked in due to alliances. Hostilities between France and Britain within North America begin in 1744 when French forces at the fort of Louisbourg, near Englishtown on our map, begin to raid English settlements nearby. The war officially ended in 1748 with no territorial gains on either side, yet fighting continued in Nova Scotia and Acadia well beyond that. By the time fighting broke out again in 1754, the British colony's population numbered some 1.5 million, compared to perhaps 75,000 in the French colonies and a few hundred in Spanish Florida. This new war would spread from the colonies to Europe as the 7 Years' War, and was known in the British colonies as the French and Indian War. The effects of this war were very far-reaching as far as the colonies were concerned. This war transformed the map. Starting in 1755, the British began to capture and transport French-speaking Acadians from Nova Scotia and Acadia. The Acadians had remained loyal to France, and many were returning to France. Others were shipped to other colonies on the eastern seaboard, with a small group going to England. Colonial forces were also heavily involved in operations against the French on the frontier, to include several future leaders of the Revolution, most notably a 22-year-old named George Washington. In the peace treaties that ended the war, the Spanish lost their territories in Florida to the British in return for the British returning Cuba to the Spanish. The British then divided the territory into two colonies, with Pensacola as the capital of West Florida and St. Augustine the capital of East Florida. Next, the French lost its territories in and around the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River, and all territories east of the Mississippi River. Lastly, as concerns territorial changes, the French ceded to the Spanish the remainder of the Louisiana Territory to include the city of New Orleans. The British then reorganized the new territory. The area along the St. Lawrence River, formerly known as Canada, was renamed Quebec. They also reorganized Nova Scotia and brought the new lands of Acadia and Cape Breton Island into the colony. In 1769, the Isle of St. John was separated out from Nova Scotia and is now known as Prince Edward Island. As can be seen from the map, the French and Indian War was very critical. Not only did it pretty much unite the territories of North America under British control, it also removed from the British colonies any real threat of attack from any foreign power beyond the natives. With the Native Americans, too, there was peace. The British Crown restricted colonial efforts to the east side of the Appalachian Mountains after the war. The colonies had already reached this barrier, and indeed, one of the causes of the war was the conflict between the settlers and natives in the Ohio River Valley beyond. However, with the Native Americans sticking to the west of the mountains and the settlers restricted to the east, there ceased to be conflict between the two peoples at that time. With the peace that came from both the defeat of the French and the treaties with the natives, the British government began to restrict the importation of arms and munitions into the colonies and turned troops and ships stationed in the area towards enforcing trade laws that had previously been routinely circumvented and ignored. Military forces in the colonies no longer protected the colonies as much as they became a national police force focused on the economic interests of the state. It was these changes that served to push many of the colonies to seek to create their own nation, yet they were by no means united in this case. For this last map, I've reverted to using mostly the names of the colonies as opposed to the major cities. I think that for American audiences in particular, it's important to note that at this time, that there were more than 13 colonies in North America. In addition to the 13 original colonies, there were the former French territories of Quebec, Nova Scotia, and St. John's Island. In addition, there was also the Spanish territories of East and West Florida that had come under British control. And there was also the old British territory of Newfoundland, making a total of 19 colonies and at least one other settlement besides. In addition, the border area between New York and New Hampshire remained somewhat porous and rather undefined. When the 13 colonies began to fight the Revolution in 1775, this area would coalesce into its own country that eventually would take the name Vermont. Vermont would remain its own country for the next 18 years. Often in the U.S., we have this impression that the 13 colonies were somehow it in North America for the British Empire. We kind of know that Canada was there, yet it really didn't play any sort of significant role in the conflict, and very few of us even think of Florida at this time. Yet these other colonies existed, and they remained loyal to the Crown throughout the conflict. During and after the war, they served as a refuge for loyalists fleeing from the revolutionaries, including about 10,000 loyalists from the New York and New Jersey area who, after the war, relocated north and helped form the new colony of New Brunswick, which split from Nova Scotia in 1784. Within the next 5 years from the point on this map, the issues that separated the mainly New England colonists from Crown interests would come to a head, starting a revolt that would lead to a rebellion and the foundation of a new country. So yeah, that was kind of a marathon, although we did cover, about 250 years worth of history. I mean, that's something. So if you did manage to stick with me, good on you. And if you like what you see, please be sure to subscribe, like and subscribe, and give me some feedback. Thanks. Bye.